Welcome to the Anthropology in Business podcast, where you'll learn about the many ways anthropology is applied in business and why business anthropology is one of the most effective lenses for making sense of organizations and consumers. Through conversations with leading anthropologists working in advertising, marketing, consumer behavior, organizational culture, user experience, and many other roles, you'll learn firsthand what it means to do business anthropology and how the work differs from academic anthropology. We'll discuss issues like the pace and depth of research in business, our visibility and influence as practitioners, and what we can do to build our brand. We will also focus on the value and impact of our research in business so that we can help business leaders understand why they should be hiring anthropologists. I'm your host, Matt Artz, a business anthropologist specializing in design anthropology and working at the intersection of product management, user experience, and business strategy. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Matt Artz of the Anthropology in Business podcast. I'm here today with Yaya Ren, who has a very interesting academic background, both having an anthropology degree and a JD. She's also the founder and CEO of PreeMe+You, a tech company. So it's a pretty interesting journey from academic anthropology to founding a tech company. I think you're the first on the show who's made that journey. So thank you for coming on. I really look forward to talking to you about it. So would you start by telling everybody just your story of how you got interested in anthropology?
Thank you, Matt. I'm so excited to be on. I love anthropology. My heart's an anthropologist, and I feel like I grew up, being born in Taiwan. We lived in the Middle East on the border of like Yemen and Saudi Arabia, sort of hanging out with the Bedouins and observing this sort of group of monkeys, actually, that lived in the mountains next to us. And so when I got to college and took my first anthropology class, sort of everything came together, and that was the start. And just, I guess, very quickly, the field of expertise that my anthropological research was based on was looking at personhood at the beginning of life. So I did a lot of research in the neonatal intensive care units, looking at how intensive care gets globalized around the world, around this question of the beginning of life, where you have an in utero fetus, which is a biological, organism as a human with its own genetic mapping. And then what happens when there is a premature birth and the biological organism is still the same, still a fetus, but yet it's now ex utero and has a different social status. And what does that mean? And I investigated that in the United States and in Asia. And through that work of really understanding the biocultural interactions, it led to really trying to help families and medical teams understand all the multifactorials of what it means to have a viable human being. I know, the present times, there's a lot of, personhood issues around the idea of viability. And actually my dissertation, it was called Viabilities, looking at all the different abilities and all the different ways that it takes to shepherd in a human life, social, cultural, biological, et cetera.
Great, thanks. And so was this always the plan? Did you plan to start a company in this space, or did that just happen?
I never thought I would ever be in tech. That was like the absolute last thing on my mind. And to be fully truthful, I don't really love tech all that much. I feel like it's something that's out of Pandora's box, and I see that there's lots of great utility for it. But at my heart, I'm an anthropologist like you and many of your listeners, and I really believe in the essence and something not recreatable in the face-to-face interaction or in the human-to-human interaction, in the space of when we interact, we're always making and remaking ourselves. And finding myself in this space was an organic journey that just kind of fell upon me. And what happened was we were working with under-resourced families at the University of Chicago. And I had gathered a lot of insights to make the clinicians, the doctor and nurse, and the parent relationships much more in sync. Because when you're going through a health journey, especially for your baby, there is the medical model. There's obviously, Arthur Kleinman's patient model, and many of the things are in a disjunct. And I wanted to take all those insights and actually give tools to under-resourced families so that they had the power to go into a health situation and engage with their caretakers about their babies. And in trying to do that, we lost a lot of grants because we realized that we really needed some sort of technology tool. And of course, in academia, nobody really funds anything unless you have research, but then we don't have research into the use of technology in neonatal intensive care units. So therefore, we couldn't get any grants. And I was lucky enough to meet a consulting group that said, hey, we want to do a social give back, and could we work together? And so that kind of started on my journey of take it one piece at a time. What does it mean to create an app? What does it mean to give information to under-resourced families? And one thing led to another, and here I am.
And so we're going to get into some more of the specifics of that. But could you just maybe help situate us a bit? Were you, as you started building the app, were you doing this as like a side hustle for a while, or did you jump right in?
It was actually a side hustle for a long time. I, like many of us, you go through anthropology, you get a PhD, and you're writing your dissertation. Maybe you get married. So I got married and had a child. And as I was writing my dissertation and waiting for that next perfect academic job to pop up that would fit all the different criteria of what my research topic was, I thought that what would help me move along in academia was to just continue my research as I saw fit. And along the way, I decided the best way for me to be an future amazing, professor somewhere, I would have to have medical collaborators. And so I thought I'll just, start that ahead and just started collaborating with them. Little did I know that would completely take me in a different direction.
So out of curiosity, did you suffer from any identity issues with not doing the academic route? Because I've heard before, there are some people who maybe they wanted a tenure track teaching position and weren't able to find, the right position, and they felt as if maybe they failed. Did you have any of that, or, and if so, how did you kind of overcome that?
Yes, of course. I think any one of us that, goes into anthropology, and I think this is part of the institution of anthropology, is that at least when I was in graduate school, it felt like the only way to execute anthropology in the way that I loved was to go into academia. There were no other routes. UX, you and I have talked about this, wasn't really a job you could have. It was just like people that knew stuff. There were no listings for anthropologists in companies like Google or Intel or things like that. And so that was never really open to me. So I thought the only way that I could do anthropology was to be a professor. And I love academia. I still do research. And it's something that I'll always will love. At the same time, like you say, there are moments where you think to yourself like, oh my gosh, I'm executing on building a company, and those are very different skills than research skills or listening skills or meta-analytical skills. And there are times I definitely miss, doing deep level meta-analysis. And then there are times I think to myself, wow, I'm being stretched in such amazing ways that I probably wouldn't have gotten had I gone down the academic route, right? How to integrate research with social media, with fundraising, with creating tech from the ground up with a tech team. To give you an example, in my dissertation, we had talked a lot about helping clinicians message different things for public health for preemies. And of course, during the pandemic, a lot of families are skeptical of vaccines, and that's not necessarily great at protecting premature infants. And so our doctors, they can talk about vaccines until they're blue in the face, but not until they go on Instagram. And we've set up Instagram in a way for them to, talk about vaccines on Instagram. Do people actually say like, oh, well, now I'm kind of more open to it, right? And so that's sort of taking a piece of anthropological analysis and then applying it to social media in a very specific way.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because, at this very moment, I am working on a presentation that I'm arguing that we need to be creator anthropologists. And by that, I mean we need to use the skills and techniques of content marketing to get our message out there to a broader audience that is outside of the discipline of anthropology. And that does mean often packaging, your anthropological insights in a, arguably non-academic way in some sense. And some people view that as maybe like cheapening, the work. How do you feel about that? And what have you learned from that? And, do you have any suggestions for anyone?
Yeah, I've actually personally just gone through like a huge arc of that. I think when I was just very early on in founding the company, when I didn't know very much, having come from a research perspective and academic perspective, I wanted like so many levels of nuance and depth, right? And I got this like zing in my brain when people gave like all this nuance and depth and all this meta-analysis on a particular topic. And I realized that is amazing in terms of getting the insight, but to actually operationalize that insight, you really have to synthesize and reduce it down to like one sentence or two sentences. And I know that sounds really obvious, but it is so hard to do. And my personal experience with that is I wrote, my dissertation project was Fulbright funded, and I wrote a 450-page dissertation on all the nuances of personhood and agency at the beginning of life. And I had this moment when I was launching the app and it was about to go into the app store. And in the beginning of the app, it talks about like, what does it mean to be a preemie? What does it mean to be in the neonatal intensive care unit? What does it mean when you have a birth that's out of sync with time, right? All these like very big topics. What does it mean when you have maturation? When the body has to be held still while you allow the body to continue to grow. So the technology is not actually curing anything. The technology is holding time for the body to develop and emerge as the organs develop. So you can imagine the levels of complexity, right? And theorizing in this. 480 pages, and I literally had to reduce it down to 6 slides, like in the app, to tell families like why this app was important, why I had created a color system, why in this app there are different levels of knowledge that are coming together, but I couldn't say that, right? In my dissertation, I talked about the epistemologies, the epidemiological idioms and the epistemological idioms for how do you talk about the body. And all those insights mattered for the technology, but it's almost like I couldn't show all the work that I had to do. And so I think it's a mindful moment of validating yourself and saying like, I've done the work and I'm proud of all of the work that's been done, but I don't have to show people that I've done all of it. Like, it's okay that you just see the one line. It's okay that you just see that NICU care takes time. Babies move through 4 color stages, right? I don't have to show how intelligent or smart I am. And I think that for me has been a personal journey of looking inward to really find your intuition and validate your own voice and your own expertise, as opposed to looking outward in terms of receiving a grant or getting that next level of promotion or writing the book with the right bibliographies and the right theories.
Out of curiosity, though, and thanks for sharing that. That was really, I think, a wonderful explanation. But when it came to raising money for the app, did the level of research, the depth of the research that you produced, was that helpful? And again, I know you're not going to show, the dissertation to any VC. I don't mean in that sense, but did they value that it was, really well researched?
There's so many levels to that question. And actually, it's something that my team and I deal with like all the time. And I will say that the research really matters if you care about founding a company that you believe will actually impact how humans behave or how you can improve human interactions or how you can improve human lives. So on an absolute value, the research absolutely matters. However, I will also say that there are a lot of companies out there and there are a lot of venture capitalists out there who are sort of thinking about, can they get to the next stage of funding, right? They're kind of thinking like, I'm funding the team and the personality rather than the strict research. So I have found that when I'm fundraising, you almost have to put on two different hats and you have to ask your audience what they're ready to hear. Because for some venture capitalists, they really do want to hear the research, but they never want to, they cannot get in it as deeply as you have as a researcher, as an expert, or as an anthropologist. So you always have to kind of give them your high level, much more broad summary of the things that you've done. And that's something that I have had to learn. As an anthropologist, what I love is our ability to speak in nuances. And it's almost like sometimes when I am in the business world or I'm pitching to VCs, I almost have to like rewire that part of my brain and just take out the nuances and just give like a very, very clear summary of the clear insight.
So speaking of the nuance, as a founder, CEO, how do you cope with all of the nuance, when trying to really steer the ship of an organization, which presumably could go in many directions at any point?
Yeah, that's a hard one. And it's something that I'm still growing and learning every day. For example, I woke up this morning and my tech team basically said in not so many words, like, we're having trouble matching our front end development, which is like what you see on a mobile app, with the algorithm analysis on the back end. And of course, like this happens all the time, right? There's a disjunct. The back end work takes a ton of time. It's super labor intensive. And the front end is kind of the showcasing of the back end, right? So you can imagine that like you're in an IKEA closet and you've like unwrapped all the boxes to make the shelving. And so on the outside in your room, like the shelving looks amazing, but in the closet are still like the boxes that are like not folded up. There's maybe like an extra screw in there. And sometimes you need that screw for the front of the bookshelf, but then you can't find it because that closet is like a hot mess. And so that's kind of what happens like in every tech company, right? There's always like that IKEA closet where the boxes are. And so in those moments, you have to think like, you have to really just learn to not be a perfectionist. I think that's maybe the takeaway. And that's a harder thing for me to do. And I've really had to learn this coming from loving anthropology and analyzing anthropology, because we always want to capture every nuance, right? And when we're dealing with issues day to day, we have to really pull back and say, okay, if my technology is able to capture the medical histories of babies for 500 days or 100 days, but maybe I don't quite yet have the funding or the repository to hold that many histories, how many days of histories will you actually need, right? Maybe you only need like 30 days of history. So that's something that I think anthropology is really helpful for. You can always go back to locating and doing the ethnography of what people are actually doing in the units, on the ground, whatever you're working on.
So we've spent a little time talking about your perspective on, on founding and how you've approached that. We haven't really, and I know you've mentioned a few things, but we haven't talked too much about PreeMie+You in terms of exactly what you do. I know it's kind of been sprinkled in, but how about for the listeners? Would you just tell everybody exactly what the app does?
We are actually a predictive analytics and patient engagement platform. And I know those are all like tech words. So from an anthropological perspective, what we're doing is in the neonatal intensive care unit, you have this issue of premature babies are born, but because they have had a traumatized birth, their genetic pattern of fetal growth and development is no longer following the general track that they were supposed to be on if they were in utero. So because we have imperfect external wombs, that developmental trajectory is now askew and to be determined. So even twins who have the same genetic material, if they're born prematurely, they will follow separate tracks because the technology is imperfect. But the survival rate of premature infants is over 90%. And so one of the things we address with this technology is, how do you help parents cope in a medical crisis when you're faced with uncertainty, right? There's a lot of medical crises out there that happens when you are uncertain about the outcome, right? And short of an uncertain outcome, what people really want is like a crystal ball, but we can't have that. So what's the next best thing? The next best thing is, what everybody wants is kind of a spirit guide, someone that really understands the medicine and the social journey that can say to you, hey, at this stage, I know you may be feeling like this, and I know things are uncertain, but there are some things that you can do to feel like you have some comforting boundaries around you, right? And so when babies are in the neonatal intensive care unit for 20 or more days, which is the average length of stay, it goes from 20 days to 100 days. When you ask a simple question like, how is my baby doing today? And when am I going to go home? If you ask that question, you'll get like so many different answers. Nothing is straightforward. And families are just like, I don't know what you're telling me. You're telling me a whole bunch of nuanced information. I can't locate what that means. So through my dissertation work, we created an illness severity scale, and I condensed that into a color journey system. And so now we input algorithms based on medical protocols, based on how the baby is doing, based on best medical practices. And then we also put in there levels of how parents may be responding at different stages based on how their baby is doing. And we basically analyze all of that to say, how's my baby doing today? Your baby is in this color in this key area, right? Your baby's breathing, eating, sleeping, temperature control, which is homeostasis, your nervous system, and your overall growth. So all of these things have to integrate and come online for a baby to survive and for life to truly happen. And so how do you communicate the complexity of that in a quick way that allows parents to feel empowered and prepare for an uncertain future, but somewhat pretty certain that the baby will survive, but we don't know to what extent, how, and what they should do in the meantime. So our analytics platform has an app that is for parents to get into the mindset of their doctors so that they can answer the same medical questions that their doctors are answering day to day, and then they can receive a quick color assessment. And then from that quick color assessment, they can take that and they can go to physical therapy. And the physical therapist will say, oh, based on this color, you should be doing X, Y, and Z. Based on this color, your baby's eating should be like this. And so this way, parents can gauge if their baby's moving forward or backwards. And it's also a faster way to communicate with doctors and nurses who will give you an explanation that's very thoughtful, but sometimes very complicated. So we have that piece, and then we have an analytics piece that is able to produce and predict length of stay.
So this is obviously, as you said, it's a time of crisis. So emotions are running high. Being human-centered is, of the utmost importance here, right? It's not about the tech, but it's really about in a sense, maybe the education and the comfort you're providing, if I'm sort of paraphrasing properly. But doing that through a tech-enabled solution still has its challenges, even if you have the research and you understand it. So what did you have to, what were some examples of things that you had to overcome to really make this effective?
Yeah, I think the biggest piece of creating any technology is adoption. And adoption in a medical space is the hardest thing to do. For example, when you think of the iPhone or something, right? Like that was like a pretty hard adoption when people had to switch their brains to be like, oh, I can do everything on my phone. But in the medical space, you have the double challenge of you want to introduce some positive new behaviors, but at the same time, you cannot disrupt too much, because if you disrupt too much, a human life is at stake, right? So, any kind of health technology, I think there's a responsibility where you have to research it very, very well. And the practicalities of bringing technology into the neonatal intensive care space is that the neonatal intensive care space is very high barrier to enter. These are precious babies. Almost nothing gets in there. And this is where I think having the research really helped us get adopted, because I had spent my entire graduate school career researching the NICU. So that gave me validity with the doctors and nurses. They believed and knew that my insights were valid. So that allowed us to say, oh, let's introduce this technology first, but with babies we know we're going to go home in 4 days, right? Because what if you introduced a new color scale and a new system and the baby didn't match what the app was predicting, right? Then we would have a problem.
So was the color scale completely your creation?
So I have a co-founder, Dr. Bree Andrews at the University of Chicago. She and I were both trained by neonatologists. She went on to become a doctor, and I became an anthropologist because I couldn't really handle blood and stuff. So she and I co-created this color scale together, and it really was a marriage of clinical protocols and the anthropology of the parent experience. So she knew all the medicine, but it really takes, and she herself, what I love about her is that she is of an anthropological mindset to understand that there are things in medicine that she doesn't have time to do. She just is so busy every day taking care of babies and making sure that they survive to the next day that she can't do the social work that an anthropologist would do to say, hey, the parents are confused by these 4 things that are being said. Let's, condense that into some sort of color system so they can understand that my baby's breathing is in a different stage than my baby's eating, than my baby's, ability to maintain temperature control. So we created that system together, and I give her a lot of credit for seeing that there's no time for an anthropological nurturing kind of care. Not that the clinicians don't want to do it, they simply just don't have enough time, and there's not enough of them.
So what I find interesting about that, and you kind of touched on it, is, in anthropology, we talk about frameworks, right? And there's maybe an emphasis on, such explanatory models. So I just find it, I'm really inspired by you, sort of taking the research in that way and creating this in a way that is really simple and easy for everybody to understand, which again is not easy to do. I appreciate you had, your kind of, your partner in doing that. But having gone through that experience, did that teach you anything as well about how to communicate with the public?
Yes. And, a lot of it is, I think when I came into this project, I had already had the insights. I knew that there were generally, four stages that parents went through before they were going to leave the neonatal intensive care unit. And so I also knew that there were sort of four stages that could be mapped onto almost every health journey, right? You can kind of collate all the medical anthropology literature, from Arthur Kleiman, from, just, other medical anthropologists, and you could come up with this. The trick of implementing that was getting the people that were actually doing the medicine to share with you their thought process and getting them to see that their thought process could also fit into these four stages. And, and what I learned was, one of the things that in fieldwork that you learn is to almost like be kind of quiet in the background and just listen. And then at least, one of the things that, maybe that I've just kind of done, and maybe it's coming from having done a lot of field work, is you tend to be very like, yes, and like, tell me more. And to create a technology, I had to actually go the opposite, right? I had to actually be like, look, there are four frameworks and you might want to add a fifth, but that's actually both not practical and that's almost too much nuance, right? And so you almost have to pull back and make some judgment calls, which I think for me, that's been a learning curve to be able to like make a judgment and say, yes, that's all true. Yes, all those levels of nuance are great. But for this project, we're just going to like cut it off at level 2 of nuance, right? Anything past that, I'm just going to have to make a judgment call and say, for now, we're just going to have to like table all of that. Being trained in anthropology, you never want to say no to anything. And the first thing that I've had to learn to do is like say no, or let's put a pin in that a lot, just to move things forward, because people can meta-analyze like all day. And the smarter the people are, the more they can meta-analyze.
Yeah, and translating that into a tech solution is, can be very costly. It's for all of his faults, Steve Jobs in his sort of second go around at Apple was, at least you could make the argument, good at saying no, right? Especially when he came in and got rid of many product lines. But saying no then frees you up to do many other things.
Right. Yeah, my tech team, we always, one thing that I do bring with me from anthropology is like, I really love open communication. And I think one of the strengths of being an anthropologist in the business world, or if you're an anthropologist, you want to be a founder of a company, is that you never personally learn to take anything personal. Like when people kind of give you feedback, like you just, we have to do this in our own research, right? We have to like know our own biases. And so I think that's been helpful, because when I ask for feedback, like my tech team is always like, Yaya, you have too many words, right? And I'm thinking I've already condensed it down to a paragraph. And they're like, I need less. So they're telling me like, oh, the app has too few words, has too many words, there's too many words. And I keep telling them, when people are sick, you want more information, right? Like you do want more words than you think. Like we can't just swipe right and swipe left really quickly on like an image. Like that's not going to do it. It might do it sometimes, but not all the time.
So let's talk a little bit about that interaction. I've made the argument that I think anthropologists should consider product management, which in many ways you have essentially been doing as the founder, right, with the idea. So I've been arguing that anthropologists would make good product managers, aside from just say working in UX, if they want to go into tech. And I feel that way for one reason being that, you are the sort of culture broker sitting between those teams who speak different languages. You can sort of help make trade-offs. And so, you're agreeing with me. So I presume that you feel the same way. Would you build on that in any way? Anything that you would suggest to people who maybe want to get in tech and are not sure about UX?
Yeah, I think that anthropologists are perfectly positioned to be that product manager. And like exactly like you said, they have to translate between the actual needs of the person using the technology, the real world ethnography, to the business strategy, which is like sometimes, we are a social benefit startup. And so we have some leeway, but still we have to keep the lights on, right? We have to pay our developers, whether it's through equity or through, just salary. And so there's a real like business need to have to be able to like either be on your way to revenue or think about revenue. And I think an anthropologist can hold each of these value systems, even if they're contradictory. And I think that's very, very helpful. I do think that to do this job well, the things you have to add to your anthropological toolkit is one of, I think leadership is too broad of a word, but there is a kind of like give a command in a thoughtful way, but you want to stick to it, that I think I've actually, as an anthropologist, had to learn. Because in my training as an anthropologist, I was never really, we don't have the opportunity to like create a project or a technology where we are actually just like giving out marching orders, right? That's a very uncomfortable thing for me to have to do, is like give out marching orders. And one of the things that I realized moving into more of the applied business world is, marching orders in and of themselves are not bad things. People actually like the clarity. When you give them sometimes too many options, you realize that like sometimes your team members just want to be told like, am I building towards, are we going to build towards a swipe right, swipe left kind of, code? Or are we going to do something that's, much more traditional, like a yes or no button, right? Like they just need a decision. But that decision is a product manager's decision. Like it's such a small thing, like what button do you have on an app? But that has so many implications, right? If you wanted to ask a really important question about, is my baby on a ventilator? You don't want to swipe right and swipe left because people start to think that's like Tinder. And so it doesn't feel like it's gravitas. So maybe you actually need to go back to something very boring, like a yes or a no, right? And tech comes with its own culture, right? The tech culture is always like, whatever's the newest thing and the coolest thing, like that's what we want to pull off the shelf and put into the app. And as the anthropologist, you have to say, hey, look, I know that new cool thing is really awesome, but when your baby is sick or in this context, we may actually have to go back to an old-fashioned thing because that feels like it's more appropriate. And so I think that's the job of a product manager, right? You're making a decision on like the design or the code or the direction of the features of the app, but you have to kind of locate it in a good rationale. And that's what people are looking to you to do.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's always about aligning to the product vision, which is, really meant to serve humans in the end, not the technology. So that was all great. I appreciate you sharing that. Is there anything, that you want to sort of give a plug to? I know we've talked about the company and I'll link to it in the show notes, but anything that you have coming up with the organization or any talks yourself?
Let's see. I don't have anything like, particular to plug. I mean, we are in pilots in hospitals. So, if anybody's an anthropologist at a hospital that has a neonatal intensive care unit, I'd love for them to reach out and we can chat and bring our technology to you. But I guess the plug that I would love to do is, as I am, doing all of this work, I oftentimes like think about, oh my gosh, here is an insight that I would like to share, or here's something I would actually like to meta-analyze more. And I simply kind of don't have time to, write a paper. And so I guess the thing that I would love to invite people out there listening is that, if you are in academia and you are working on, papers about technology, like, hit me up. I'd love to like co-author with you. Like that would be really fun. Like I said, I love doing both. I love the product side, but I also love the academia side. And if there anybody's, out there doing that, I'd love to just, let's co-author something.
And if anybody wanted to get in touch with you?
They can find me at yaya.ren at PreeMePlus.com. It's PreemeAndYou.com.
Thank you for listening to the Anthropology in Business podcast. To learn everything you need to break into business anthropology and why business anthropology is one of the best lenses for contributing to business success, visit my website at mattartz.me, where I cover many topics related to business anthropology and beyond. There you will find all the podcast episodes, blogs, and news. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.